There was a fear that I had moving forward into the next phases of Bleach. A fear that one character's miraculous survival could cause detrimental ripple effects through many characters' stories moving forward. The fear that Byakuya Kuchiki somehow surviving his apparent demise would be a big problem later on from a narrative perspective. And now it's time to see if I was right to be afraid. The focus of the battle that we've been watching shifts to Rukia Kuchiki, having just returned from the Soul King's palace, hopefully stronger than ever before. We saw in the last chapters that growth that Renji went through, so now it's time to see what his childhood companion has learned since the last time we saw her. Let me just say, Rukia is fantastic. I don't say that enough. She has always been great from the very first chapter of Bleach. For a while there, in the early parts of Bleach, Rukia almost felt like the second main character of the whole series. She had her own very different arc that was happening right alongside Ichigo as she helped guide him through his early days as a Soul Reaper, as she learned a lot about humanity, and then that bond between the two of them became the driving force of the Soul Society arc and the whole story for a long while. Rukia was easily one of the most important characters, but circumstances have kind of put her on the back foot in recent. She still had great impactful moments like her defeating her personified trauma against Eren Yarrow, or when she stabbed Ichigo again to restore his Soul Reaper powers, but she doesn't spend much time around Ichigo, at least not nearly as much as early on, and instead has kind of fallen in with a lot of the other Soul Reaper characters. And that's fine. Rukia certainly earned that spot after what she went through in the Soul Society arc. It's great seeing her rise in position. With how many characters Kubo juggles now, Rukia just doesn't usually get nearly the amount of focus that she used to. And that's okay. The story evolves, characters' roles change. But man, does it feel great when Rukia takes center stage again. And this is one of those times. As Not coming back was exciting for me because I absolutely loved him as an antagonist during the first invasion of the Soul Society. For me, As Not was easily the Stern Ritter that stood out the most and that I most enjoy reading so far. He's just got an interesting aesthetic and perspective that really strikes a chord with whoever he's speaking with and with me as a reader. Like I talked about at length back then, I just love the horror elements that he naturally sprinkles back into the series with his fear-based powers and his philosophies, and these chapters now give us a bit more insight into where that actually comes from. And it's pretty fascinating to start to kind of literally unmask and peel open this character. I was just so happy to see him back at the forefront, especially since he's taking on the sister of the man whose Bankai he stole and the sister of the man that he nearly and almost definitely, from my perspective, killed. His reintroduction was fittingly chilling as Rukia feels a hand brush her without actually seeing anything. Like, that kind of thing freaks me the hell out in general. So it immediately put me on edge and reminded the reader of who this character is and what he brings to the table when he's around. As Not offers a different kind of terror that the series doesn't use much. It's all creepy, I love it so much. I honestly forgot that this would be Rukia's first time meeting him. He was so important to that fight with Byakuya, but I'd forgotten that Rukia wasn't actually present at the time, but he makes it clear who he is very quickly. So it's established that there is a bit of a shared history here, at least a person in common between the two of them. She knows what he did to Byakuya, and while it wasn't as severe as it initially seemed, he still stole her brother's Bankai and hurt him really, really badly. There was a part of me ever since the first invasion, especially when I thought that Byakuya was dead, that was hoping that Rukia would face As Not to get revenge, and we sort of get that opportunity here, but after everything I talked about in a recent video about realizing how Kubo handles revenge, it isn't quite that, really, and it helps that she doesn't actually have to avenge Byakuya's death since, you know, he's somehow still alive. Instead, she's simply trying to defeat someone that hurt her brother and that's desperately trying to frighten her in the same way, and she's standing firm in some really cool ways that I loved. Ever since seeing Rukia back as a Soul Reaper and in action for the first time, I kind of questioned what made her abilities different than Hitsugaya, since they were both obviously kind of ice-related, it seems. Though she didn't have an ice dragon helping her out, Rukia's just seemed more elegant, like a dance, but it made so much sense that her sword was about lowering bodily temperature rather than using moisture in the air. Really cool distinguishing thing that introduced some great dynamics with her abilities as she lowered her own temperature to counteract Aznot trying to poison her with fear like he does to everyone else. I couldn't help but think about the connection that fear sends chills down your spine, you know, that it literally can lower your body temperature because the response can divert blood. So I kind of loved that Rukia lowering her temperature actually allowed her to more easily overcome the fear, and that it lines up with Aznot's philosophy on fear, how everyone is scared of dying, how everyone is scared of the unknown of death, and she kind of literally puts herself in that state so it doesn't bother her because she's already there. And the potentially detrimental risk that Rukia is taking just by using her power offers a nice extra layer of stakes and something to overcome, since she can't instantly raise her temperature back up. It was great stuff, and you could see that power really start to scare Aznot and start to really set up the truth of his character. That a lot of his talk about fear, a lot of his using fear, a lot of it is projection, and he's the one that's really afraid. And when Aznot starts to get scared, he really lets you know. He goes from completely calm and in control to panic the moment he's truly threatened. Like full-blown freakout. After listening to both the original Japanese and the English dub of the scene, both voice actors did great in conveying his meltdown where he's completely lost his composure. And it works so well and is startling in an entirely new way because it's so uncharacteristic of who Aznot has shown himself to be so far. Up until that moment, he's creepily calm and monotone, spending his time giving unnerving soliloquies about the nature of fear, which I'm always here for, by the way. I love his soapboxes about fear. But that all slips away when he's literally unmasked when we get to see the first glimpse of what he really fears, the fear of eternal punishment. Considering he was apparently found by Yuabaha while hospitalized and near death, scared of what would come after, his character really comes into focus more. This little flashback, as brief as it is, really sticks out to me because I think it's the first time so far that we've had a real look into the past of any of the Vandenreich members, and it raises some questions for me like, when was this? And what exactly is the timeline of the Sternritter recruitment? I feel like most of them weren't with Yuabaha 1,000 years ago, back when they were defeated. We didn't see any in the original 13 flashback during that battle, so I assume that they were recruited along the way, and the technology in the hospitals certainly isn't from a millennia ago, so were most of them brought on board fairly recently? Like, Yuabaha got his power back, right, 9 years ago, according to that whole prophecy thing. So I assume that he picked Aznot up in that period, so like somewhere within the last 9 years, and that's when he was able to give him a part of his power to save his life and to give him strength, maybe. But as far as the other Sternritter, were they all recruited in that same 9-year period, or have they been recruited throughout the 1,000 years? I don't know. But it makes sense that Aznot has this very deep understanding of fear when he's a man that is in a constant state of terror himself, that's experienced utter despair but then lived through that when he thought he wouldn't, thanks to Yuabaha, and is now terrified of ever being in that position again, of experiencing that again. He doesn't want to feel that pain, but more importantly, the risk of being punished in death. Now knowing this, to me it feels like the mask he wears is kind of reminiscent of the oxygen mask that he wore back when he was on his potential deathbed, and I've thought a lot about that. It's almost like he's still wearing that oxygen mask in a way, a reminder of what he was before Yuabaha, only this mask isn't hooked up to hospital machines, but is instead hooked up to the thing that's now keeping him alive, that kept him alive when he was about to die, Yuabaha. His outfit, his Quincy uniform, the mask he wears, they're all signifiers of his connection to the Vandenreich, to the Quincy King, and as we see him grow more panicked, more fearful of what's to come, he sheds those clothes, those layers, because it's all just a brave front to hide how truly frightened he is beneath the power that's sustaining him, that's been given to him, but can be taken away. His fear of punishment, of damnation, has kind of just been carried over and warped into a different shape, but with the same fear at the core. Instead of being afraid that he's going to hell, As Not is afraid of disappointing Yuabaha, who he essentially views as God, so that's still in a way a punishment from God. Being given power and mobility and more life by the Quincy King didn't rid As Not of his fear, it just shifted it to something, to someone else. Even his Volstern-Dish's name is about the fear of God, which could be interpreted as his fear of Yuabaha, fear of being shamed by someone he owes so much to that he owes his life to, fear of punishment from someone above him. As Not's appearance once he used his Volstern-Dish really lives up to the whole concept of the character. He becomes something straight out of a horror movie. Like, look at this guy. It's so much scarier than any of the other transformations we've seen the Quincy undergo so far. The peeled lips, the eyes that are like 98% rolled up, but you see the irises just peeking out at the top, the stitches, the voice in the anime, it's all nightmare fuel and looks like it belongs in a completely different series in some ways. I loved that Rukia couldn't attack him when he was like this because her body, her nerves were too scared to, that she was overwhelmed by what her eyes were witnessing, even though body wasn't being affected by the fear that he initially tried to use. And it didn't matter if she closed her eyes because of what her memory and her mind remembered of what she saw. A little personal here, but that's what we do here sometimes. But I'm someone that's dealt with PTSD, and a lot of it was dealing with imagery that I'd seen that would replay in my memory. So the horror of that power really hit close to home, because that is absolutely terrifying and crippling when you can't get something out of your head that scares you and your whole body reacts to it. I do wish that the imagery we saw of Rukia's fears was a little different than what we saw of Byakuya's, but it was similar imagery, you know, her surrounded by flies, her seeing her loved ones kind of decompose. I wish it was a little more personalized to her, just to like a little differentiate between them. Maybe I'm thinking too much about Pennywise and Freddy Krueger and how they attack people in a very personal way, and the imagery typically is very personal to the person they're targeting. Or maybe Byakuya and Rukia just share a lot of fears in common. Or maybe, as I'm thinking on this, maybe it's just an example of As Not's fear projecting onto them, that it isn't really their fears, but it's his fear overwhelming them, because that would make sense. Decomposing, flies, the fear of death. It could be that that's just As Not's fear, and that's a big key to all this, is it's not so much they're afraid as much as it is he's afraid. So maybe that is just, you know, an example of his fear being materialized in a way, and not theirs. I don't know. Byakuya arrives to save Rukia, and this is when I kind of started to hold my breath. I have been very clear about how much I kind of would have preferred that he really died during the first invasion, that I was worried that his survival might take more interesting opportunities away. But I have always said that I am open to the story proving me wrong, for Kubo to show me that there was good reason to keep Byakuya around, that he could convince me that there's stuff he needs to be here for. And now that he's back in action, this was the first chance to possibly see that it was for the best, to see that I had no reason to fear the storylines that his survival absolutely affects. So did this change my mind? Did this convince me that Byakuya should be alive? Well, let's get into it. There's actually a lot to unpack here. Byakuya coming to his sister's rescue was a very heroic return, undeniably, but we've seen him come to help her before when he stopped Zamari from killing her in a fight that's whole purpose was to show how much he now desires to protect her after nearly letting her be executed. So Byakuya being willing to come to Rukia's aid isn't anything new really, that's not the surprising thing. No, the part that's new is that Byakuya shows how much he trusts her and believes in her now, and is willing to let her handle this fight on her own because he knows she can. He believes in her, he lets her know that. It's an incredibly big moment for her. So there's that. And while this is happening, As Not breaks down even more, which really brings out some real body horror, and Kubo goes crazy with it. It's almost like when As Not is backed into a corner, he needs to try and ramp up how scary and gross he is, desperately trying so hard to get a scare out of his enemy, and his final transformation is disgusting. Like, truly, utterly disgusting. But not only that, this deformed version comes out of his previous self, like it peels him open, and then his previous form is just like hanging off of his chin like dead skin. Damn, it was gross. But it is important to show that this came from inside of the man that we've been seeing so far, that he's slowly been peeling back the layers until this is who he is at his core. This mangled, screeching, terrified shape that looks more like a mutated cadaver than a person. Tying into what we know about him, that he was sick and bedridden on the verge of death, and that everything Yuabaha gave him is meant to stave that off. This is who he really is beneath all of that. This scared, gross, dying thing, clinging on to life because he's so scared of what happens if he dies. But I loved that Byakuya's speech to Rukia, that reminding her that the fear that's happening isn't hers, but is coming from this horrifying thing in front of her, is this big moment for her. You know, this moment when Byakuya trusts her is so beautiful. What happens with Rukia next is something that I've anticipated for a long time. Something that, of course, I've been thinking about since we first learned about Bankai. What would Rukia's be like? And it didn't disappoint. It's one of the heftier transformation when it comes to Bankai that we've seen, because she like full on turns into something else entirely. Something beautiful and powerful and ethereal, but in a completely different way than she already was. Her Shikai had this graceful dance quality to it, and the Bankai just expands on that kind of vibe. She becomes this bright force of nature, something that's aesthetically so different from her opponent, that completely overwhelms Not as he instantly freezes and crumbles to nothing. His last thoughts are fittingly about how afraid he is, terrified for what's going to happen now. Now that he can't force his fear onto others, he has to face it himself. He fears death, he fears divine punishment, and now he has to actually deal with that. I really loved As Not as an antagonist, but this is a great way to finish him off and feels right as his conclusion. Rukia overcoming her fears with her now supportive brother by her side, defeating the man that he hadn't been able to before. It was great. I'll miss As Not's fear tangents and his spooky vibes, but he was great while he was around. I don't know where he's going after this, but I feel like he probably was right to be afraid of it. As for Rukia, I just loved this moment so much. Byakuya being there for her, acknowledging her growth, essentially telling her he's proud of her for the first time, is just so beautiful. Absolutely beautiful, so fulfilling for her, and I loved that she got to hear that and have that moment. It was great. So what I'm about to say next isn't to take anything away from that scene. Definitely not. But could she still have had this moment, or some variation of it, if Byakuya was dead? Honestly, yes. There are ways to reach that same moment for her with him not actually being there to say it. Rukia could have remembered her brother, remembered the kind of man he'd become, used the memory of him, the recent good memories, to help her overcome As Not, to help her push through that by looking inward and finding him in her heart and all of that. That's a possibility. Would it have been as effective? Maybe not, but also maybe yes. Hell, Renji telling her that her brother would be proud of her might have even been a little more poignant even. They both knew Byakuya extremely well, they both knew how stony he could be, they both had fought for his respect and his approval pretty much throughout their whole careers as Soul Reapers. There are few people who would have been better to relay that message to her than Renji in Byakuya's absence. In a moment of shared grief and of shared love of a man that was now gone, using his memory to help move forward. Don't get me wrong, I don't know if it would have hit as hard or has been as powerful, but the bittersweet, very real tragedy aspect of that might have given it even more weight, maybe. Sometimes you don't get to hear the things that someone never had the chance to tell you, but in your heart you can feel that it's true, that they're looking down on you, smiling, as many like to say. I think that's as powerful, if not potentially more so, than having them miraculously survive to say it to you, because there's the underlying sadness of never really hearing it with your ears, but realizing it all the same. I think that could have been extremely powerful. I'm not going to say for certain that it would have worked as well, because maybe it wouldn't have, but it's just something that came to mind. So really, was this enough to make me personally okay with very, very convincing fake out death and then miraculous survival? I don't think so. No, not completely. Byakuya coming back still doesn't really sit right with me, you know, and it's not this scene's fault. Like, this was a beautiful moment. I just think that Kubo was too convincing with Byakuya's quote-unquote death the first time. Maybe if that hadn't been so drawn out and seemed so final at the time, I don't think I would have cared as much that he, survived. I would have been like, oh good, he survived. But instead I'm like, oh my god, how did he survive? But I've talked about that at length, and I'm not sure this was enough to make me look back on that and be like, yeah, I'm more okay with that now. I think it wasn't handled like it should have been if this was going to be the outcome. But there's still time for Byakuya to do more or something else. But at the same time, I don't want to take away from this moment because it was still very powerful. It just wasn't fully enough to change my mind about Byakuya, honestly. But when it comes down to it, I do love what this whole sequence meant for Rukia. She's been this incredible character on this great journey, and this was such a good moment for her to have. From that perspective, I'm okay with it because this was a very fulfilling, satisfying moment. I don't know, I'm conflicted. I'm still conflicted. I feel like I'll always be a bit conflicted about this. But when it comes to this moment, on its own little island, not thinking about Byakuya's survival, it was beautiful. It was great. Perfect opportunity for her to show her Bankai, a great moment for her to connect with her brother, and a fitting farewell for a villain that I really enjoyed. These were a great bunch of chapters, and I'm excited to see what happens next. I'll miss what Asnot brought to the story. Characters like Rukia finally found their power, found their courage to really show their true potential, and hopefully Byakuya will do something else that will hopefully make me regret ever questioning his survival. As always, thank you so much for watching. Really appreciate it. If you want to see more, we have a Patreon where I do manga read-alongs and anime reactions, so there's hours and hours of content over there if you want to see my expanded thoughts and my initial thoughts as I'm going through the series, preparing for these analysis videos. There's also reactions to Demon Slayer's anime, read-alongs for Hunter x Hunter, Tokyo Ghoul, lots of stuff. So yeah, see you all soon. Thanks for watching. Hope you have a great day. Take care.